Hello. I wanted to take a couple minutes and kind of explain some of the process that I've done for refinishing the wood in our boat. I've done quite a few videos, 5 or 6 or so, actually probably a little bit more than that, on work that's already been done on the boat. So doing a walkthrough and you can see all the woodwork, but all that had to start from somewhere. So our boat was, most of the interior of the boat was painted white. Needed to be stripped down, sanded, stained, varnished, 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 sanded, varnished, sanded, sanded, varnished, varnished. Long process, but anyway, what I wanted to do is just take a couple minutes because I think maybe there might be some interest on how I did what I did. It's not difficult, it's just time consuming. So I wanted to just explain a little bit. So the first thing that you need to do is get the wood down to a point where you can stain it, right? So the wood in our boat, like I said, was painted, so we stripped it down. I used a stripper, a good stripper, not an eco-friendly one by any chance, by any stretch of the means. When I started doing the boat, it was 15 years ago, so you could get some pretty aggressive paint removers. So did that, scraped it all down, and then proceeded to sand. So to sand, I did a little bit of hand sanding, but most of the work that I did was with a random orbital sander. I used 120 grit paper to get everything down, which is exactly what I did on the boarding ladder here. This is half of it. That gets it down to a nice smooth finish. Got all the, between the sanding and the stripper, I was able to get all of the paint out of the wood. So then after that, then it's staining. So for staining, which you can see behind me, the ladder has been stained. So of the mast pieces, as part of the projects that we're working on this winter. Stained it using, you can use whatever stain you want. I used velvet oil. This is a velvet oil number 203 warm cherry. I just like the look of it. My dad used it on his 1966 38 Commander. So that's what's been done now. To do that, I used a little microfiber cloth and just dip it in the stain after the stain's been mixed really well. It's a filler stain. So dip it in there, do a nice even coat, which I've done some videos of that, some time-lapse videos of what we've done for the mast parts and the boarding ladder. Once that's done, it needs to dry. You want to make sure that it doesn't, it's not wet, because what happens is that when you put the first coats of varnish on, or the first coat of varnish on, it could run. So you want it nice and dry, which is exactly what we have. This has been sitting here for a week now. So the next thing I'm going to do is, what I'll do today is varnish. So I'm going to varnish a couple of different steps on this. So the first thing is you want to make sure that you get the varnish to adhere to the wood. So you can't put on you can't open up a can of varnish and just go. You need to obviously do all the prep work, but you need to cut the varnish. By cutting it means you reduce it with using mineral spirits or a brush thinner. I'll show you that in a second, but what that does is it allows the varnish to penetrate into the fibers of wood, and it helps it to adhere to the wood. So what you do end up doing is basically it's 3 different cuts of varnish. Generally I put on the first coat, it's a 50% cut, so 50% varnish, 50% thinner, and that allows it to get into the fibers of the wood. The second coat, no sanding in between, is a 25% cut. And then after that, generally I can start to do a little bit of sanding, but the third coat and every coat after that is anywhere between 5 to 10% a cut. So you're only putting 5 or 10% of thinner into the varnish. So I use Epiphanes. So I've used it for the entire interior of the boat. It's a great varnish, goes on really nice. It's personal preference. I mean, you can go out on the web and you can find, everybody has their own recommendation. Use what you want, but the rule I would say still applies. You want to do 50%, 25%, and then 5 to 10% cuts after that. So I use this. This is Epiphane's clear gloss. It's a high gloss varnish. I use this to cut, and then after that, I actually like to use Epiphane's wood finish gloss. The wood finish gloss allows you to put on successive coats without having to sand in between, as long as you put it on within 72 hours. And I've used both. I've used Epiphane's brush thinner, but I've also used mineral spirits as well as a cutting agent. So your personal preference, if you want to do their stuff, it's pretty expensive for a thinner. I've had success in using other thinner, just a basic thinner that you can buy at a big box store. So again, I use a bunch of measuring cups. This is how I get my my percentages, just doing a straight mixing. And I use a container. Usually I try and use a container like this, buy them real cheap at the store. They don't seal great, so I only use this if I've got like quick time between coats. In this case here, I had one that was put 10% on here. I just mark them on the top in case I've got other stuff going on and I'm in the middle of a 25% cut, 10% cut, whatever. But like I said, these don't seal really well. They're not vacuum tight. So I'll sometimes spray a little bit of propane in here. It takes the air out, keeps it from coagulating, and these work great. So I do that in between just to mix them up, and I keep track of it that way. And then for a brush, I used to use foam brushes like this. You can buy them pretty cheap too. The only thing I don't like is sometimes the longer you use them, they get kind of loaded weird. They're okay because you just throw them out when you're done. You don't have to clean. It's great, but I don't like the way that over the years I've used these. They're okay, but I don't think that the finish, when you get to the final coats, and especially if you're building up and you want a nice mirror finish, I like to use a traditional brush. This is just a 2-inch. It's a 2-inch brush for multi-purpose. It's nothing fantastic. From my point, I've used Epiphane's makes a brush. I've used those. I've used the foam. I've used a Purdy brush. This is just Worcester from Home Depot, and it's a nylon polyester mix. And I think it's fine. I've done quite a bit of work with this, and it's okay. I mean, I don't spend a ton on brushes. I mean, these are probably 10 or 15 bucks a piece. They're not fantastic, but they do a good job. How you lay out the varnish, it works out really well with this type of a brush versus the foam brush. So I do that. Once I get down into the first sanding, I end up using a sanding block, and I use a specific type of paper. This is a 3M paper. This is 120 grit. This is what I would normally set out, this or 220 grit, to knock the varnish down and get it to a smooth state. I use this particular type. This is a pro grade 3M product. What I find about this is it doesn't grab the sanded varnish, right? It doesn't knot up. It stays relatively clean, which is important. So I use this in between my coats when I do sand, and it does a really, really good job. Obviously, the more coats you put on, you keep sanding it, so it gets flatter and flatter. So at one point in time, you're sanding, and it's pretty smooth, and that's really what you're looking for. Dust-free environment is also a key. Tough to do here in my basement, my shop, but what I do is I use a spray, a fine mist spray bottle, and I go around before, if I'm doing work inside, not on the boat, I'll go around and I spray around to take the dust out of the air, and then I can quickly put a coat of varnish on, and I have really good results with that in keeping the dust out of the air. dust obviously settles on it, and then you have little bumps, and it's not really cool. So that's it. Those are pretty much the tools that I use, but I just figured somebody out there might find it interesting. If you got questions or anything, you can post in the comments, but other than that, it's time for me to get going. So have a great weekend.